Oh my days. And this wave, thank you.
London is busier than ever. But keeping this megacity moving has always been a battle.
You don't think that 150 years ago there were people down here digging tunnels?
In this series, we'll go behind the scenes of today's underground trains and buses.
Yeah, they're both east and westbound.
That's the train that issued the Mayday call.
And we'll discover the 200-year history of the world's oldest public transport system.
The Underground was a huge hit from the moment it opened in 1863.
From the first ever underground railway to the birth of the traffic light and the Route Master, a bus that came to define London, built using World War II technology.
So this bus, if you like, is a bomber on wheels.
London's transport system has changed the face of the city.
So it wasn't the case that the tube followed the expansion of London. London followed the expansion of the tube.
And pioneered new inventions that have become icons.
London was going to create this really fine public transport system, the absolute best system in the world.
This is the story of London's transport, then and now.
London is an extremely difficult place to get around. We Londoners spend years of our lives moving from one part to another.
With 30 million journeys across London every day, the capital is now busier than ever in its long history. As the numbers of people in a city keeps rising, moving millions of us around is a constant battle against congestion, pollution, and traffic jams.
What are we at the last count? 8 million in London? And that's dramatically gone up since I started cabbing.
Oh, my man. Have a good day, guys. Been more traffic, more cars, more congested over the years.
Every single street in London, there's masses of people walking. And it's just so busy.
But traffic jams like today's have been around for at least 200 years. With the Industrial Revolution powering the empire, and with London at its heart, the population of the capital exploded. In the first half of the 19th century, it grew from just over 1 million in 1800 to over 3 million by 1860.
No one's really in charge, no one's in control. Traffic moves as and when it can. And it became more and more acute a problem as the decades went on because the population of London simply went on and on and on growing. And the infrastructure really couldn't cope without any of the traffic control measures that we have today. It was a jungle.
But then it looked like a solution was on the horizon when a man from South London had a brainwave. His name was George Schillerbeer. And in 1829, he tried something completely new. He started running a horse-drawn cab for up to 20 paying passengers along what is now the Euston Road. It was known as an omnibus, and it was the very first form of public transport ever seen in London.
So being a bus driver back then, it was probably much more difficult actually driving a bus than it is today. I would have liked to have had a go with a horse-drawn bus in London, in the congestion that was around then. You've got to try and control a horse, which is probably not an easy thing to do. Because if that horse wants to go, he's going to go. With this will only go where I send it.
Within 20 years, there were dozens of omnibuses running on routes right across the city. Today, there are around 9,000 buses on London's roads, running on almost 700 separate routes.
London now is narrower than it ever was before. So the roads are narrower, you have more people using public transport. There's more and more buses these days, probably better buses. Maybe the driving's better, I'm not so sure. Yeah, Mr. Shillibeer, when he started the concept of the bus, from the horse-drawn carriage till today, his legacy is that he's provided the public with transport. He's started what we see today.
But despite the invention of the London bus, it couldn't stop the Victorian streets from filling up with ever more traffic.
To drive through London, you have to be super aggressive and very determined. And you get very dirty, you might get injured even. Drivers can use their whips on each other and on each other's horses. You've got a lot of swearing and yelling, shouting. Very, very difficult for pedestrians to cross streets in most areas, in the centre of London.
But the 1830s didn't just see the arrival of the London bus. The first railways were steaming into the capital too. But by law, these new railway companies were forbidden from building their main stations in the centre of the city.
The main London railway terminuses were all built in a ring around the edge of the inner city, and the reason for that, I think, was the big estates that owned central London didn't want railways pushing into their valuable land, so London didn't link up.
These new railways meant even more people and goods flooding into the capital. But with no way to get around the city once they'd arrived, London was at risk of grinding to a halt. But then came a man with an idea years ahead of its time. Charles Pearson was a London politician with a striking vision. He put forward the idea of a brand new railway to be built underground.
Charles Pearson had a dual role. He was the solicitor to the Corporation of London, which ran the City of London, but he was also a social reformer. And he wanted to clear the slums from the edge of the city. And he thought that the people who lived there would have a better life if they lived in the countryside. And he promoted the idea of what he called oscillation, but we call it commuting.
In 1863, Charles Pearson's vision was realised, and the world's first underground railway was opened. It was a triumph of Victorian imagination and practical know-how. Now, for Londoners, getting from home to work was about to become fast and efficient.
The Underground was a huge hit from the moment it opened in 1863. The Metropolitan Railway got more and more people, so quickly, it couldn't cope with the demand.
Being on an underground train would have been a hugely unnerving experience. These large trains operating in relative darkness, the incredible amount of steam and smoke, but also, massively exciting, and it was highly successful.
A number of companies, they were rivals to an extent, but they started to work together. There was the District Railway and the Metropolitan Railway, but they teamed up and they started to create lines that intersected and connected, and this all happens furiously fast.
The opening of the Metropolitan line in 1863 was followed by the Hammersmith and City in 1864 and the District line in 1868. They were built using a system known as cut and cover.
They're just below the surface, and they were built by digging up a road, creating a trench, putting the railway in the trench. Then you put the top back over with girders. You recreate the road. If you'd stood above the grills along that road, you would have had a sauna effect, because the steam would have come up from the steam trains.
Good evening, this is a Circle Line service via Paddington. This train is now ready to depart. Stand clear of the doors, please. Mind the closing doors.
Many of today's tube trains are self-driving along parts of the line, but they still run through the original Victorian tunnels.
The train communicates with the track. It literally lets you know exactly how many metres you are to the next station, and it just goes. It knows exactly where you are. No matter what, you're always going to need a driver on the front of the train making sure the track ahead of you is clear. Just for instance, anything happened, I'd always be here to emergency brake anyway. To think that the work of people from 150 years ago is still being used now, modern day technology and stuff like that, it's quite cool that they've built the basis for everything. Because when you're a commuter just jumping on the train, jumping on and off, you don't think that 150 years ago there were people down here digging tunnels and stuff like that, but they were smart. Circle Line alone does hundreds of millions of trips every single year. So I'm literally thinking, if the work from people 150 years ago did that, and now we're completing hundreds of millions of journeys every single year, how would we survive now if we didn't have that from then?
In its first year, the Underground carried over 100,000 people. Today, the Tube moves around 5 million people every day. Now, there are 11 separate tube lines and over 250 stations, and it's all controlled from here.
Yeah, that's him there, sitting there.
Right, okay.
So he looks
unhappy, doesn't he?
Yeah, he looks a little bit distressed. So if he's gone onto the track, I'm assuming that it's going to be before train 3, so that's the one that's reported it.
They've done really well there. Excellent.
One of the things that amazes me is how complicated our network is. And so much work has to go on behind the scenes just to make our network run each day. And what we find is that things go to plan, we have books, we have schedules, but then something will happen. And it's the expertise of our controller, and they have this years of knowledge that they've built up to coordinate our service so that we're running a smooth service for Londoners.
The Tube may be packed today, but 150 years ago, there was far worse to cope with than just your fellow passengers.
Well, we invented the Underground railways, but we invented them too early. We began when only the steam trains were available. Initially, the Metropolitan had a good press. It was exciting, and it was obviously very futuristic and progressive, but then it dawned on people it's actually quite hard to breathe. And the train crews were given special permission to grow beards to try and filter a bit of the steam and smoke.
But Victorian Tube travellers were to be saved from choking to death by a newfangled invention.
Well, the first electric trains in London are in the 1890s, and they arrive as soon as it's possible to build an electric train, 1, and an electric train underground, 2, with new tunnelling techniques, 3. So it's instant. It's the latest technology. It's like when the internet and mobile phones got going, and we've seen that digital revolution in recent years. It's the same kind of revolution, super fast, and theoretically, it was going to make London move very efficiently and very quickly.
With electric trains, it meant the tube lines could now be buried deep underground. It revolutionised the new network.
So the slightly ridiculous situation whereby you'd had underground railways like the Metropolitan and the District just going around the edge of the centre of London like a polo mint, that was changed, and you then began to have trains able to penetrate into the very centre of London, and that's what people really wanted.
By the end of the 19th century, London had become the biggest, dirtiest, busiest city the world had ever seen. The new underground was helping, but on the roads above, it was still a free-for-all. There were no rules for driving on the right or left, and the traffic was building every year. Coming up, we go above ground to see the challenges faced on London's roads and the bizarre story of the capital's first ever traffic light.
It is from here that a goodly proportion of our day is organised, shunting us to and fro over the tortuous expanse of brick and stone which is London.
By the late 19th century, London was busier than ever in its history. But with crowds came chaos. In the 1860s, hundreds of people were being hurt or killed just trying to cross the road.
Trade was piling into the city and out of it, so it just simply jammed up, with people riding their horse wagons and just shouting at each other. I mean, it's just like taxi drivers will shout out of the window to cyclists and vice versa.
One of the worst black spots for accidents was right on Parliament's doorstep.
There's one really bad junction, pretty much where you find the statue of Winston Churchill today in Parliament Square. There'd been several accidents over the years. 2 MPs had been injured by passing traffic, and a policeman was killed when a horse drove into him. So something had to be done, particularly at that junction.
Faced with another transport problem in the city, the London authorities fought back with a pioneering solution. The first traffic light anywhere in the world, and it first lit up on the 9th of December, 1868.
It was 20 feet high. It had waving arms that would go up and down, very much like an old railway signal, to indicate when people should stop or go. And it was controlled by a policeman, and it was powered by gas so that it lit up.
And right from the start, they used the red-green system, which we know today. But because not everyone understood these lights, and because visibility could be low because of the fog and the smog, quite a few drivers just ignored it completely.
The traffic light received mixed reviews. The Illustrated Times said, "The regular town drivers are fairly, and to quite an unexpected extent, amenable to the signals." But not all the reviews were favourable.
Punch magazine in particular drew this amazing cartoon of the traffic light as a looming apparition coming out of the fog. This thing is 6 meters high with these huge arms coming out. It must have looked quite frightening in the mist with the red glaring light at the top. So it wasn't the biggest success. Indeed, one day the thing actually blew up and badly injured the policeman who was manning it. That was pretty much the death knell for that traffic light.
With constant breakdowns and the fact it was largely ignored, the traffic light was finally removed just a year later. Traffic lights were not seen again in London until 1926, when a manually operated series of electric lights was installed along Piccadilly. Today, the capital simply wouldn't function without traffic lights. Transport for London controls not just the tube and buses, but the main roads as well. This high-tech control room is where all of the capital's traffic lights are now operated from.
There's 2 elements to Transport for London. There's the London Underground, and we are part of Surface Transport. We are managing the road network 24/7, 365 days a year. And our primary focus is on moving people, goods and vehicles around the network.
Compared to the first Victorian gas-powered traffic light, the operation that goes on here is state-of-the-art.
I'm checking with buses to see if there's any delays with
Okay,
minibus.
great. I'm going to check Stamford Street just to see what the approach is to that junction, because if we pull that junction, we're going to create congestion behind it.
Traffic lights in London are controlled dynamically using sensors. This is an example of a sensor. It's basically a magnet. We bury it in the road, we plop it in, we cover it with tarmac, and every time a lump of metal passes across it, it detects it. What that does is it gives all those counts to the computer system. The computer system determines how much green time each arm of the junction needs in order to minimise congestion and excessive wait times for people in vehicles.
This technology is now in use at 2/3 of the capital's 6,000 traffic lights. But with millions of road users moving around London's ancient network of roads, there are often incidents that are beyond the capability of TfL's computer system.
What we see on a daily basis in the control centre is all the anomalies that happen, the stuff that happens around London, whether that's a delivery van parking in the wrong place, or a broken down vehicle, or a road traffic collision, or anything you can think of. We see it all in the control room, trust me. The system is only able to deal with that within certain parameters.
When an incident occurs that is beyond the computer system, TfL have to rely on the human element. The operators here then step in, and using over 1,500 CCTV cameras, are able to control the traffic lights manually to keep things moving.
There's a map here, and depending on the location, I can just zoom in, zoom out. I can type in the location and pick a camera. So what I've got in the map is the traffic light itself, the traffic light on the screen. I've also got it here on CCTV. This is junction 1/46, which is Vauxhall Bridge Junction with Millbank. We've then got the ability to zoom in on the camera, the ability to turn it left and right and pan. We've got zoom functionality, which is quite a powerful zoom. We can zoom all the way down from the north side of Vauxhall Bridge to the south side of Vauxhall Gyratory, and we can then look at the incident. And we've got a suite of plans, and they're all titled accordingly with different stages to assist the bridge southbound, medium assist, heavy assist. We can assist Grosvenor Road. So all these are different plans that I can implement on this junction to help ease congestion if there was something happening there.
In contrast to today's advanced traffic management, life on London's Victorian roads was much more unpredictable, mostly because the major mode of transport back then was the horse. Towards the latter part of the Victorian era, there were over 11,000 hansom cabs on the streets of London. There were also several thousand horse-drawn buses, making a staggering total of over 50,000 horses transporting people around the city.
The horse traffic was as dense as car traffic is today, and the speed was about the same as today. The other thing was fascinating, of course, really interesting. In the ecology of London, horses tend to leave large deposits.
Have you ever walked behind a horse for a sustained period of time? You know, splat, splat. They give back what they take in, put it like that. You have got swilling about your feet. Manure, urine, feed.
It gets rained on, and it gets run over, and it gets trodden in. So it's turned into a kind of semi-liquid slush, and that spatters all over the clothes of people on the pavement and the goods displayed in front of shops. That includes meat hanging outside of butchers.
The problem of manure piling up on the streets reached its peak towards the end of the 19th century.
What happens is things reach a tipping point where in 1894 it's called the Great Horse Manure Crisis. And I think not just the Times newspaper, but it's one of the papers that throws their hands up and say, you know, in 50 years' time, we're all going to be sort of drowning under a stack of horse manure. What's going to be done about this problem?
Part of the reason London was drowning in dung was that the population had exploded in the latter half of the 19th century. The number of people in the city had doubled, up from 3 million to now 6 million. More people simply meant more horses. It was clear that the use of horsepower was such a big issue that an alternative would have to be found. At the start of the 20th century, the omnibus companies began experimenting with a new invention, the petrol engine.
The first petrol bus that we would recognise as a bus was built in 1898. It never actually went into service. From about 1904, they started becoming more prevalent on London's roads. The technology was there to build more reliable vehicles.
From the start of the 20th century, the motorbus proved enormously successful. Companies were no longer interested in horses. The motorbus was simply more profitable. And one particular model proved to be a huge hit.
The B-type bus was the first successfully mass-produced motorbus. There were about 3,000 B-type buses built by 1914. The key thing was that it was made of interchangeable parts. So one thing broke, you could replace it with an identical part. This is what made the B-type bus such a huge success.
By 1914, the last horse-drawn omnibus service was finally closed down, just 15 years after the motorbus started on London's roads. Now, the new B-type bus was king.
The B-type bus was built specifically for London traffic and London use, so there's a lot of stop and start, and the engine had to be built quite robust, lighter than the previous vehicles. It had a top speed of nominally 12 miles an hour, but since there were no speedometers, it's all guesswork how fast they actually went.
These new buses were so reliable that new routes were soon developed. They linked up with major train stations and connected more of the suburbs and surrounding countryside to the city. But as the First World War approached, the new B-type bus would play a vital role in the conflict. coming up. As the new London bus goes to war, many of the drivers and bus crews go too. Women are drafted in to help keep London moving, and it kicks off a London transport battle of the sexes.
The passengers wait in a queue, thinking only of one thing: time. How long shall we have to wait? How long will it take? When shall we get there?
In this series, we're telling the story of transport in the capital and how it has shaped the city and our lives, then and now. Up to the end of the Victorian era, transport in London was dominated by horses. However, by 1914, it was the motorbus that was king of the road in the capital. But as the First World War approached, the bus would soon be called on for a much greater service than carrying commuters to work.
Just before the war, London was increasingly filled with motor buses, and these were the ideal vehicle to be requisitioned to carry troops, particularly kind of from rear areas to the front line on the Western Front in northern France and Belgium.
But it wasn't just the vehicles that were called up.
The crews and the drivers often went with the vehicles, and about 1,000 of these buses were requisitioned during the First World War. You know, not just a case of the machinery, it was also the manpower as well.
The battle buses and their crews' main task was to carry troops to the front line. But for the bus drivers, they were being transported to a world that couldn't have been further from the streets of London.
Unlike most of the army personnel who would go through several months' worth of training before they actually saw any action, the bus drivers were going straight there with their vehicles and were operating quite early on in 1914. And it would have been a very sort of alien experience for drivers that were used to going up and down sort of major thoroughfares in central London to operating a few hundred yards behind trenches and under shell fire.
The war that was meant to end by Christmas was going to place enormous strain on London's transport system. Huge numbers of the vehicles are requisitioned for war purposes, and you lose overnight majority of your male workforce.
The key features in terms of making up that gap is to increasingly employ larger numbers of women to do roles that they weren't previously permitted to do.
From March 1915, women were employed as bus conductors, cleaners, and on the underground in various capacities, but they were not permitted to drive buses. By the end of the war, the London General Omnibus Company had employed over 3,500 women. Thousands more were employed by the other bus and tram operators in London, as well as on the tube.
It was a hugely empowering involvement, and it sort of opened up opportunities, but at the same time, it wasn't done on an equal footing with men. It was done on a basis of it being a temporary role. They were often described as substitutes.
Drafting in women to fill the places of the men at war seemed like a perfect solution to the problem. But the bus and tram companies were soon to run into trouble.
Now, women knew that they were needed. They were being employed in unprecedented numbers. So when, in 1918, the Committee of Production awards wartime bonuses and they give men a bigger bonus than women, well, do you know what? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that women, always good communicators, are going to find a way to hit back.
They were angry that they hadn't received the pay rise that the men had been given, and they weren't prepared to take it lying down. On the 16th of August, 1918, a meeting of women transport workers at Willesden Bus Garage decided to go on strike the following day without informing their bosses or the unions.
Women and men withdrew their labour and London ground to a halt. You couldn't find an omnibus anywhere on Victoria Forecourt or any other forecourt in London for that matter. And what happens is you get what's called wildcat strikes. So think in Brighton and Hove, Bristol, Bath, supermare. There's like, it catches on, you know, it's the vogue. And there was no Twitter, Facebook, no social media in those days. So it's worth bearing in mind that this kind of wildcat striking picks up on the mood of the country, which is tired and fed up. And the strikes are successful because a week later, those women are given their 5-shilling bonus. And I think, because we're talking about exactly 100 years ago, it's worth bearing in mind, therefore, what pioneers these women were.
It makes me feel really proud to be a woman that 100 years ago, when conditions were so different then, it was like being a woman to actually strike and like say, right, we are fighting for our rights here. To me, they've definitely paved the way for even me being a female bus driver today. They've definitely paved the way, and I'm really proud of their achievements.
A century on from the Wilson strike, today there are over 2,000 female bus drivers.
Driving in service for the first time, it was like amazing. I loved it. Like all those passengers coming on, and I was like, hi, morning, morning.
Natasha Smith is one of the current crop of women who worked her way up to become a London bus driver.
I just love being a bus driver. I think it's the best kept secret. Hey, he's the reason I'm here. He is the guy that passed my prelim. Love you, Colin. Hello, everybody. Welcome back.
Natasha was such a hit with passengers that she was promoted after just 2 years.
Like you said, you like humour. What is that saying? Find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I just felt like every day I was happy to get up and get to work, and oh, I just loved it. I really loved it. I mean, to be honest, I even got drug tested twice for being too happy at 5 o'clock in the morning. But the thing is, it's just because I loved being at work. I just loved the job. It's like I would do it for free. Getting paid was a bonus.
And now, Natasha is teaching the next generation of would-be bus drivers.
Who wants to sit in the hot seat?
Good morning, ladies. Is it on? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your driver speaking. Unfortunately, we have to wait at this bus stop for a short while due to heavy traffic ahead. I do apologize for the delays, and thank you.
That's brilliant.
Get what you're gonna say.
Although women were working in bus garages at the end of the First World War, it took much longer for them to be accepted on the London Underground. In fact, up until as recently as the late 1970s, the Tube was still very much a man's world.
The trains on the Victoria line are worked by one man.
When the Sex Discrimination Act was introduced in 1975, London Underground began a programme of training women to drive tube trains. 3 years after the Act was passed, the Tube had its first female driver.
Mrs. Ann Dadds is something different. She steps into history as the city's first lady motorman.
But as with all pioneers, it wasn't an easy ride.
I remember when she started, she couldn't just come onto the Underground and get a job as a train driver. She had to work her way up, whereas a man would come straight on as an apprentice.
Ann Dadds was employed by London Transport as a 9-to-5 ticket collector. She learned to drive a train in case of emergency. From that point, ambition took over.
It was very hard for her, especially the training. She's got a lot of stick. Women shouldn't be doing men's jobs. You were capable of doing it, and no one really expected her to pass, but she done it.
Easier than driving a car, says Anne, but the responsibility of transporting several thousand passengers a day is a heavy one, and she knows it.
She showed them. She worked harder to prove them wrong. She wanted to be accepted, yes, but if you don't like it, tough, you know. That's how she was.
Our Aunt Hannah would be very proud, and it's a shame that she's not here with us today to celebrate.
40 years after she made history, today, the Tube is commemorating Hannah Dadds' achievement. Today, there are around 7,000 women working across Transport for London.
Piccadilly Circus is a great station to work for. It's in the heart of the West End. It's very vibrant, very colourful. The different nationalities, different characters that come through. They ask very, very obscure questions as well. That makes you feel like you've got to be a bit of a Wikipedia for London.
Every single day, the system carries around 11 million passengers. But how many of them give a second thought to the man who created the system as we know it today?
The entrance, the ticket hall, the ticket machines should be so designed and placed that we are kept steadily and smoothly on the go.
Coming up, we tell the story of the man whose innovations built the transport system we all know.
Sometimes of the day, it seems that all of us want to get to the same place at once. It is almost as if London itself tilts and shoots the bulk of its population pell-mell into one small area.
The Tube has become an icon of London, famous the world over. Its logo, its map and its stations have a unique look and feel we all instantly recognise. But it didn't happen by accident. It's thanks to a man who took charge of London transport in 1933.
London Transport was founded in 1933 as a public corporation. This organisation was headed by a man named Frank Pick. He was its chief executive, and he was a great administrator, a great visionary, and a kind of secular saint as well, this deeply moral man who believed that Londoners, whether they were living in Stepney or South Kensington, should have the absolute best public transport system in the world.
In the early 1930s, Frank Pick set about turning what was then a ramshackle collection of Victorian private companies into the organisation that we all know today.
Frank Pick had grown up in York, where I grew up, and York is a very user-friendly city today. And it obviously was at the time when Frank Pick was growing up there in the late 19th century. And he apparently used to correspond with a friend who lived in London. He would come down to London sometimes as an adolescent, and he would say to his mate, I can't get around London, I don't understand it. He wanted to make London like York. He wanted to teach people how to use their own city. And the first thing was to create this transport system, then tell them how to use it.
His aim was to create the world's first unified transport system, and it needed a look to match.
He was artistic, and I think that his aesthetic came from this desire to unify the system. So he came up with, or he refined, the round L. Got one there. He nicked the idea of a blue panel with white lettering in it from the Paris Metro. But he thought it would be more clear if you had a red background. Initially, it was a red blob behind the blue bar. But then he thought, no, that's too heavy. And he hollowed the red blob out, and it became a red circle.
Frank Pick pushed this concept of what he called total design.
At the turn of the century up until the First World War, you have lots of stations which become very, very cluttered. You have lots of advertising, lots of information, but all just thrown up. And Pick was able to see that and think, well, I need to create clarity and consistency. What are the key things that customers want to see on stations? So, line diagram, platform detail, what services serve that station? How do you walk through that station and use the system and stuff as well? So architecture.
The entrance, the ticket hall, the ticket machines should be so designed and placed that we are kept steadily and smoothly on the go.
He was dedicated to what he called the concept of passenger flow. So a station had to be as elegantly arranged as possible so the people coming in didn't clash with the people coming out. If there were freestanding ticket machines, they would be placed in such a place that people didn't bump into them. And if you were the manager of an underground station and you put your ticket machine in the wrong place, you would get a green ink memorandum from Frank Pick telling you to move it.
Pick obsessively reworked every element of the transport system, down to the tiniest detail.
He commissioned Edward Johnston, an eminent typographer, to do the Johnston typeface, which was a very simple typeface that could be read from a train moving at speed. He commissioned the map from Harry Beck.
Beck made a small step, but a fundamental step, by creating not necessarily a map, but a diagram. So he flushes away all the unnecessary detail, because he really realised that when people use the network, what they want to know is where they are on the network and where they want to get to. They don't necessarily need to know anything else.
He commissioned posters from Paul Nash or from Man Ray. He was progressive, you know, he was in touch with the avant-garde.
He made lots of young artists. He made engineers, he made architects, and he tried to give that sense to all Londoners, some sense of true dignity as they travelled.
Frank Pick is probably one of the unknown legends of London. Anybody who's come through a London Underground station would have had some contact with an aspect of his work. Without Frank Pick, we wouldn't have the structure to the tube system or the transport system that we know today.
One piece of luxurious design that Frank Pick initiated is something we've all experienced intimately, but are probably unaware that it's called moquette.
Moquette is an underappreciated phenomenon of a tube train, and it's another example of how Londoners have been spoilt. Moquette is thick, woolen, carpet-like material. It has a pile, which means that the fibres stand up. It's slightly three-dimensional. That holds you into your seat. Gives grip, which you need in London, because parts of London have a medieval street pattern. The trains are squirming around all the time, and often the patterns of moquettes have been stunningly beautiful. This is a good one. This is from 1978 on the District line.
Frank Pick's idea of using contemporary artists and designers continues up to the present day. In 2010, Harriet Wallace-Jones and Emma Sewell won a competition to design a new fabric for the Underground, embodying the spirit of London.
This is the Barman design, which is on a lot of the Underground routes. And what we ended up with was a design that's got 4 London landmarks hidden in it. So this shows the London Eye. And then you have St Paul's. And then you have Big Ben. And then finally you have Tower Bridge. That's the one that really foxes people because it's part of the repeat.
What I always say is that if you get on the tube and people get on and they read their book or they do whatever they're doing, and people aren't really noticing what they're sitting on, I think that means it's worked, because it means that it's just part of the fabric of their everyday travel.
It goes back to really some of the stuff that was happening in the 1920s and 30s, the sort of modernist movement, the design for things that are fit for function, fit for purpose, the idea that industrial design should serve society and not the individual.
He created beautiful things, but it was also socially useful, and this was the distinctive combination of Frank Pick. I don't know whether he was left-wing, but you would think so, because if you look at the headquarters of LT, the foundation stone was not laid by the king, it was laid by the head housekeeper. Nothing was too good for ordinary Londoners.
By the end of the 1930s, Pick had transformed the tube and London itself. No longer was the capital a mess of traffic jams and gridlock. New stations had been built. Underground lines were being extended. New tube trains were arriving, and London buses were reliable. It was a time of expansion and hope for the future. But the golden age was short-lived. War was looming. If we were to win the fight, somehow we would have to keep London moving, even through its darkest hours. Next time, we'll see how World War II takes its toll on London transport and reveal the story of how the Routemaster became the capital's favourite bus.
And you can see that next Tuesday at 8. New tomorrow at 8, there's a shock in store for the police interceptors when they catch up with a dangerous driver and discover who's behind the wheel. While there may be lots of skeletons inside the Tower of London, finding new ones is a rarity. But who does it belong to? Find out after the break.